Valchelev. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and honoured guests, Elspeth and also Tiernan, Alan's daughter and grandson respectively, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to this year's Alan Bruford Lecture. This series was inaugurated in 1996 by the School of Scottish Studies Archives and has been hosted ever since by the Storytelling Centre, Scottish Storytelling Centre, and the International Storytelling Festival, a fitting partnership for an event dedicated to the power of story and tradition. The lecture honours Dr. Alan J. Bruford, who passed away in 1995 at the age of just 58. It's hard to overstate the legacy that he left. Alan was a scholar of the highest calibre, an archivist, editor, author, collector, teacher, and mentor, and his influence can still be felt across the fields of Scottish ethnology and international folktale studies. Alan joined the staff at the school in 1965, though he'd already been cataloguing recordings in the archives before that. As archivist, he developed the systems for cataloguing and indexing that have helped generations of researchers find their way through our remarkable collections at the School of Scottish Studies Archives. He refined and expanded the Uppsala system first introduced by Callum MacLean in the 1950s, bringing his own insights and precision to the task. But Alan was never content just to organise other people's work. He was an active field worker himself, recording storytellers and singers across the Highlands and Western Isles, often alongside Donald Archie MacDonald and Ian Fraser, and he developed a special affection for the traditions of Orkney and Shetland. In 1971, he founded Tochar, the archive-based publication that many of us still turn to, now digitised and available to all of our students at the University of Edinburgh. It brought together features on tradition bearers, transcriptions, translations, and commentary and recordings from every genre, and it remains a model of how to bring the archives to life still today. As teaching and postgraduate study took root in Scottish ethnology, Alan became a deeply valued lecturer and supervisor, remembered by many as a generous and insightful mentor. And beyond all that, he was a musician, a composer, and a fine player of harp and lute, and I believe the jaw harp as well. So tonight, as we gather for the lecture that bears his name, we remember a man of many talents, a scholar, musician, and collector, but above all, someone for whom traditional narrative was a lifelong passion. It feels especially apt in remembering Dr. Alan Bruford to turn to a scholar whose work so clearly follows in his footsteps. Dr. Bob Fell took a keen interest in the cultural heritage of Scotland's Nacken community when he began his undergraduate studies at the University of Edinburgh in 2011. Bob's interest in the community developed and he went on to gain his PhD in Celtic and Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh in 2022, and I had the pleasure of supervising him along with Dr. Neil Martin. His doctoral thesis takes a detailed look at the storytelling traditions of the Nackens and shows how they embody a distinctive folkloric idiom that negotiates cultural differentiation. Bob won the Scottish Records Association's Tonic History Prize in 2021 for his work in the Topan Dulcish archive, and he published his insights elsewhere with the International Society for Contemporary Legend in 2024. His first book with Edinburgh University Press, Traveller, Storytelling in Scotland, Folklore, Ideology, Cultural Identity, also published in 2024, has been shortlisted for the Folklore Society's Catherine Briggs Award, which just happened, I think, last week, if I'm not mistaken. Congratulations, Bob. Elsewhere, Bob's activities as a commissioned researcher have seen him work closely with the Nacken community members and the Scottish Government to address their ongoing marginalisation. His work helped to secure the First Minister's recent acknowledgement and public apology for the mistreatment of Nackens, which was delivered in the Chamber of the Scottish Parliament in June 2025. As we will see tonight, Bob continues to work closely with Nacken tradition bearers and with the vibrant and complex cultural heritage that the community continue to share and to cherish. I'll allow Bob to introduce our special guest, Shamus McPhee, when the time comes. But without any further ado, please put your hands together for Dr. Balquhidder.
Thank you very much, Will. Fes Grama agus Fáilte. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Scottish Storytelling Centre. Before we get started on our topic this evening, place names in the north and the Nackens, and a curious episode at Balquhidder from our special guest Shamus, I want to begin with a few personal words about the man we are here to celebrate this evening, Alan Bruford. I first encountered Alan's work during my undergraduate courses with Celtic and Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Since then, Alan has had an abiding impact on my thoughts and interests concerning various strands of folklore, most importantly its critical analysis and interpretation. His Gaelic folktales and medieval romances, published in 1969 for instance, prompted me to think carefully about who certain folkloric characters are, and more significantly for me, how these characters function within the narratives in which they appear. It is perhaps obvious in retrospect, but it made me realise that the names, deeds, utterances of folkloric characters are loaded with meanings and symbolisms that are not necessarily apparent on the surface of the stories. As many of my friends and loved ones will attest, Alan's edited collection of Scots traditional tales, The Green Man of Knowledge, published in 1982, has become ubiquitous at birthdays and Christmas, not to mention being gifted to all and sundry at random when storytelling comes up in conversation. Alan's notes in this beautifully presented volume also touch on our topic this evening, Scotland's Nackens, Scottish Gypsy Traveller and Scottish Traveller community, where he makes penetrating insights into the nature of oral traditions and how they are modified by their tradition bearers to suit the storytelling ecosystem of their community. The Green Man of Knowledge also includes a glossary which contains a few examples of the Nackens cant, a language unique to the community which includes a smattering of Gaelic and many Hindi, Gujarati, Kazi, Kashmiri, Scots and Urdu terms, some of which we will have the pleasure of hearing this evening from our special guest, Shamus McPhee. This is a rare treat, so I hope you enjoy it. Incidentally, The Green Man of Knowledge contains a wonderful Jack tale, Jack and the Devil's Purse, from Duncan Williamson, whose memorial chair you can see here on stage. I would recommend that volume heartily. Elsewhere, Alan's notes in Scottish traditional tales, first published in 1994 and again in 2003, are similarly packed with ideas, insights and deft scholarship that has been the bread and butter of many who have passed through Celtic and Scottish studies over the years. In his introduction to the same volume, Alan devotes a substantial section to Nackens and Scottish Travellers. There's a complex landscape of nomenclature surrounding this community, and we will come to that in a few minutes. But for now, Alan refers to the community as Caird. Always good, Caird. I should have apologised for my horrendous Gaelic before I started. Anyway, the term means the term means artisan or craftsperson in English, and it is clear that he holds the tradition bearers in very high esteem. Alan speaks of their hunger for stories and how the community have kept Scottish storytelling traditions alive, while they also invented many for themselves on traditional models. These insights have been borne out and expanded upon by subsequent researchers, myself included, as Will mentioned, and this evening's lecture will showcase just what Alan meant. And this is not to mention Alan's fieldwork activities, where the recordings he made from the 1960s onwards amount to almost 2,500 tracks. You heard that correctly, 2,500. And those are only the digitised ones available on Tober and Dolkish. There are almost certainly many more held within the School of Scottish Studies archives in older formats. In the late 1970s and into the 1980s, his fieldwork included the recordings of the late Stanley Robertson and of the late Betsy White, both renowned tradition bearers who belong to the Scottish Traveller community. My own research has drawn heavily on these recordings, and many of the stories Stanley and Betsy shared and that Alan recorded may well have been lost if it were not for these collaborations with tradition bearers. Alan's contribution to the safeguarding of oral heritage is therefore truly staggering. I would venture represents many lifetimes of work for researchers and of course enjoyment for all kinds of listeners. Alas, Alan's time at Celtic and Scottish Studies was before mine, so I never had the pleasure of meeting him. However, it is an enormous pleasure and honour to be here this evening with Shamus to present the annual Alan Bruford Memorial Lecture and share some of my own engagement with Scotland's rich oral traditions. an engagement which owes a great debt to Alan and his work. In his introduction to Scottish traditional tales, the collection mentioned a few minutes ago, Alan gives a wry account of some approaches to folk narrative scholarship, from Max Muller's solar myths to psychoanalytical approaches inspired by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. But, says Alan, and I quote, "The most interesting are those who take the trouble to ask active storytellers why they themselves choose to tell particular stories in a particular way. And it is to those particular storytellers and stories that we turn this evening." So this evening, Shamus and I will give you a brief introduction to what we mean by the term Nackens. That will serve as a platform for thinking about the ways that we attach names and significance to the landscapes that we move through and inhabit. I will begin with a very brief view of the term Nackens from a documentary and oral history perspective, and then introduce Shamus, who will give you an undoubtedly more interesting set of insights from his perspective. We'll then spend a few minutes orientating ourselves with a study of history, the study of the history and origins of place names, onomastics, and then shift our coordinates to expand this study into folkloristics, incorporating alternative names for places, what is known as folk onomastics, and think about some of the implications of these alternative names for places. I'll give you a brief local example to get us started, then we'll move further north into Aberdeenshire to a more complex example involving a revenant legend. Then it's back down to Stirlingshire, where Shamus will treat us to a story about Balquhidder. We'll finish up with a few points about what I've termed the Nackens folk idiom, an identifiable folkloric idiom that stands apart from other storytelling and oral history traditions in Scotland, and for the very reasons that Alan Bruford and others before him, such as John Francis Campbell in the 1860s, have already pointed out. We'll come back to John Francis Campbell towards the end, and I hope that the body of our discussions until then will give you a clearer picture about what we mean by Nacken as an important folkloric idiom. In terms of definitions, social, political, economic, cultural, or otherwise, Shamus and I have agreed not to dwell on this too much this evening. It is a substantial undertaking, particularly for an outsider to the community, to get to grips with the intricate, rich, and often harrowing experiences of the Nackens, Scottish Gypsy Traveller, and Scottish Traveller community. However, given our present context here at the Storytelling Festival, it would be remiss not to give you a brief introduction. I'll speak for a few minutes and pass you over to Shamus for a further few minutes. As of 2011, Nackens, Scottish Gypsy Travellers, and Scottish Travellers have been officially recognised by the Scottish Government in the form of a separate ethnic category. The 2011 census carried out by the National Records of Scotland included a separate response category to allow people to specifically identify themselves as white Gypsy Traveller, as you can see on screen here. The official term Gypsy/Traveller covers a broad range of ethnicities and is therefore far from ideal, especially when we consider the unique cultural heritage of the Scottish element. Although the most recent census in 2022 did include a specific category for Roma, but the Gypsy/Traveller category remains. Perhaps at the next census in 10 years' time, the landscape will improve, and Shamus and I have pointed this out to the relevant authorities ad nauseum. In the present context, the term Nackens, Scottish Gypsy Traveller, and Scottish Traveller refers to a series of interlinked social and familial groups where some have existed in Scotland as distinct from mainstream society since at least the 12th century. Based on their lifestyles and working practices, a sense of otherness and marginalisation has long been associated with the groups, resulting in distinctive socio-cultural identities and a deep reservoir of distinctive cultural heritage. After spending many years engaging with Scotland's diverse groups of Nackens, Scottish Gypsy Travellers and Scottish Travellers, the renowned folklorist and fieldwork scholar Hamish Henderson remarked that it is vain to speak with any certainty about the ultimate origins of these people. However, Henderson suggests that the groups we know today are likely to be descended from an ancient caste of itinerant metal workers, whose status in earlier modes of society was probably very high. Henderson's observation makes some sense when we consider anachronistic terminologies for the community. For instance, the term tinkler or tinker is recorded in Scotland's 12th century fireman laws, where the groups had legal protection under which to ply their trade as skilled itinerant metal workers. In terms of etymology, according to the dictionaries of the Scots language, the word tinker first appears in Scotland as a surname around the year 1175. The definition is simple: a worker in metal, a craftsperson who makes or repairs metal artefacts, a tinker. Although the dictionary notes that the origin of the word is uncertain, it could simply be onomatopoeic. The Oxford English Dictionary offers a similar definition, including the element of itineracy, also noting that the origin of the word tinker is uncertain. As an appellation for Nackens and Scottish Gypsy Travellers, the term tinker persisted into the 19th century, where it became pejorative in the extreme. And tinker is now considered a racist slur when used in the wrong context. I hope you forgive me for using it this evening. As far as we know, in terms of documentary evidence, at least, the term Nackens first appears in Walter Simpson's History of the Gypsies, first published in 1865. This is a second edition on screen here from 1878. Simpson uses the anglicised spelling Nacken and reports that the individuals he met explained the meaning of the term as follows. They attach the meaning of a wanderer and one who can do any sort of work for himself that may be required in the world. During the 20th century, the fieldwork being carried out under the auspices of Celtic and Scottish studies by the likes of Alan Bruford and others reported that there was some variation in the spellings of Nackens, but that its referent is unchanged. For instance, speaking in the 1950s, Scottish traveller Jeannie Robertson informs us that the only word I ever heard them, Scottish travellers, called was Nackens. Traveller Stanley Robertson uses the term Nayakim, to which he attaches the meaning old traveller. And Scottish traveller David Donaldson identifies as Nackens, commenting that we are called travellers because that's what mainstream society wanted to call us. We didn't get to choose. And our special guest this evening, Shamus McPhee, identifies as Nackens. Shamus was born at Bobbin Mill, a gypsy traveller site in Perthshire, Scotland, where he still lives today. He is an artist and activist who holds a Master of Arts degree in Celtic Hispanic Studies from Aberdeen University and a postgraduate diploma in translation from Warwick University. He is a founding member of the Scottish Gypsy Traveller Law Reform Coalition, where he worked as secretary in 2006 and 2007, as well as a member of the Scottish Gypsy Traveller Association and the Scottish Travellers Against Racism Partnership. In 2008, Shamus was an expert witness in the landmark legal case that established the ethnic status of Scottish Gypsy travellers, and he was an integral part of the Scottish Government's 2025 apology for the mistreatment of Nackens that Will mentioned. Shamus's home in Pitlochry continues to act as a site of resistance for Scottish Gypsy travellers and can be seen as symbolic of wider European questions regarding social exclusion of ethnic minorities and the negotiation of cultural difference. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, Shamus McPhee.
Thank you, Bob. Good evening, everyone. Fescar Ma, Buam Sakutchuk, muy buenas tardes, Barry Ratty, to all the Barry Deacon Hantle in the audience here. It's a great honour and a tremendous pleasure to be here in the presence of such an erudite and passionate scholar as Dr. Fell. And, the only thing that really surprises me is that he hasn't been snapped up to undertake further postdoctoral studies at this point in time. And I hope that's going to change. But I have advised him to pivot and try his hand at tarot, teacups and phrenology. I do have a sister who can supply a very fetching headscarf, but obviously as a Tinker experiment victim banished by the establishment and, currently awaiting remedy, I can't be expected to supply the gold loops, can I? So I'm afraid you're going to have to go without those, Bob. It's also a tremendous pleasure to be here in the company of Alan Bruford's family, because Bob's been filling me in about, his incredible work throughout the years. So I'm gradually becoming au fait with that. And he wants me to talk about slides. Now, the thing is, I don't talk as quickly as Bob. So my brain's a bit slow moving these days. But he's selected a few slides from a piece of work I did several years ago now for Iris, which was intended as an ed memoir for social workers who are totally clueless about Gypsy Travellers, as you know. And, this was based on research that was commissioned. It took about 2 weeks to complete the research, and I had to illustrate it as well, so I was under a lot of pressure. And just did a trawl of the internet really, and here's what I came up with. So I found as a useful starting point that the Ghaznavid raids was particularly, and the information on that was particularly insightful and relevant because, it talks about the Rajput army and how Mahmud of Ghazni, who was he was a ruler based in modern day Afghanistan and an expansionist one, whose his empire extended as far as northwest India, Pakistan, Iran, and he targeted people, particularly skilled metal workers like tinsmiths, and conscripted them to serve the Rajput army, which consisted of about 60,000 people. After his death, he succumbed to malaria around 1030. They were repelled by Turkish Seljuk forces and driven into Rum in Anatolia, which is modern-day Armenia. And hence they got the name Romanes, and it comes from the time they spent in Rum as a nomadic caste. Then, the diaspora saw them move throughout Europe and eventually arrive in the UK. But we have reference to tinklers, as Bob's already pointed out, under the Farnham laws of the 12th century. And, that may have been the first usage of the term tinkler, but I'll tell you what, it's not been the last, because I've been called that a few times over the years. And this was essentially an onomatopoeic appellation, which referred to the sound that they made when they were plying their trade, the tinkling sound as they were hammering tin. And as Bob again correctly pointed out, they had the aegis of the king to go about their business, and they were recognised as a distinct ethnic group who had their own dialect and customs. Slide, Bob. So he's selected, a couple of images from the timeline I produced for Iris, and here we see reference to Spaniards in the Book of the Lord High Treasurer in 1491. It was said they danced on the causeway to King James IV, and that they were given 4 shillings, and 2 days later someone called Peter Kerr received the sum of £20 from the king and a letter enabling safe passage throughout the realm. And by 1505 we see what's been considered to be the first official record of gypsies in Scotland, because it actually refers to them as Egyptians, and again in the Book of the Lord High Treasurer. And someone called Anthony Gavino was Earl of Little Egypt, I think was the term they used to refer to him. He was given £7, and a letter was written, and it was handed to him in 1506 by King James IV. It was intended for King James' uncle, who was the King of Denmark, again enabling safe passage to Denmark. And so gypsies spread from Scotland into Scandinavia, and by 1512 they were in Norway, then in Sweden, where they were expelled. But interestingly, you can find on Wikipedia that Finnish Kali can trace their ancestral roots right back to Scottish Nackens. And that's also the subject of close investigation by someone called Dr. Douglas Sharr on his website called Hidden Jewish Ancestry, so you can find out more about that there. Next slide, Bob. Now, counter to this popular misconception that we call ourselves Nacken, I insisted that Bob include this slide here, which is taken from Alexander Russell's gypsy treatise on Scoto-Romany and Tinkler's Cant in the 1914 Gypsy Lore Society. Now, there are words in Scottish cant like shukar and murgi that are lost in the Anglo-Romany, and I think interestingly here you'll see that Alexander Russell, who got a lot of things wrong, it has to be said, actually picked up on the fact that there was a softening of the vowel sound from A to O, right? When you move from Scoto-Romany to Anglo-Romany. And he's given some examples of this. You can see the English there. Now, I don't speak Anglo-Romany, but it's Congri, Cost, Mong, Knock, Porno, Yog, Yok, Yora. And in the Scottish equivalent, we have Cangri, which is church, Casti, stick, Mang, to speak, Knack, nose, Pani, water, Yag, fire, Yak, eye, and Yara, egg. So, you know, in terms of consistency of approach, why would we call ourselves Nacken when we use A, not O? And, you know, that's why the term Nacken is probably best described by my sister as pure Disneyland. So, you know, the young Nackens coming through need to really familiarise themselves with the proper usage of the term Nacken, rather than promoting something that's, you know, incorrect in terms of the pronunciation. And that's how I see it. It says here, those differences are perhaps to be explained by regarding the majority of present-day English gypsies as descendants of a later immigration than that of those who left their mark on the Tinkercant of Scotland. So we got here first. Right, anything else, Bob, at the moment? No. That me? Back to my chair then.
Many thanks, Shamus. Shamus will be back shortly. Meantime, we'll move on now to think about place names as advertised. Onomastics is a subfield of linguistics where proper nouns are examined. Onomastics considers the names of particular people, places, objects, and the origins and choosing of these names. Onomastic examinations can also include investigations into the social and cultural significance of place names. The field of socio-onomastics, for example, considers the social, cultural, and situational arenas in which names are chosen and used. And this applies to all kinds of names: place names, personal names, commercial names, names of ships, and even names for pets. We can take socio-onomastics even further to consider folkloric aspects of place names, a so-called folk onomastics, where there is a narrative attached to the name of the place, a narrative which does not necessarily correspond to the linguistic characteristics or geographic or topographical features of the name in question. Folk onomastics asks us to think more carefully about people's beliefs and perceptions about names, and how these names are used, and crucially, why. In the late 1990s, the Gaelic scholar Donald Meek already pointed out the close connection between narratives and place naming. Using Gaelic ballads, Meek has demonstrated that place names can be symbolic. For Meek, place names can represent a point or event in time or place where the mental and narratological map of the composer can be perceived. From this perspective, the intersection between folklore and onomastics is fertile ground for study, because it can give us insights into the mental worlds of individuals and communities of tradition bearers. To give a brief example of onomastics in practice, we'll have a quick look at the village of Lasswade, which is about 7 miles south of where we are now. In a wonderfully titled doctoral thesis from 2003 at the University of Glasgow, titled, I hope I get this right, The Germanic Toponomicon of Southern Scotland, Lasswade is recorded as Ford of the Pasture from the Old English on screen here. However, according to the website Scotland's Story to Tell, which is sponsored by Scotland's National Tourism and Events Organisation, Visit Scotland, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, Lasswade got its name because, I quote, according to legend, before there was a bridge, a sturdy local girl called Jenny would wade across the river carrying travellers on her back, including a laird and his dog. The image on screen is from the interior of the local pub. Being a diligent onomastician, I had to go in there, obviously. It is now aptly titled The Laird and Dog Inn. And we are told by the same tourist organisation that the pub has a long and interesting history. The first pub was established on the premises in 1740 and was known as the Lasswade Inn. The crucial difference between these two onomastics, the Old English topographical one and the local legend about Sturdy Jenny, lies in their form, where their form can reveal function. On one hand, the Old English name for Lasswade functions to describe the landscape and gives useful information about its features, i.e. it's a convenient place to cross the North Esk River. On the other hand, the folk onomastic is couched in narrative, where the function does, in a way, describe the landscape, but its function also makes us think about historic socio-economic relationships that existed during the 18th century after the inn was established in the 1740s. Our red-haired, sturdy lass, Jenny, is presumably a local tenant who earns an extra crust by transporting wealthy travellers to the opposite bank. It is unclear whether Jenny's services extended to canine passengers. I certainly hope so. She could have charged extra for pets. In its contemporary context, the folk onomastic of Lasswade is therefore exploited in a commercial sense to attract tourists to the local pub and hotel. The narrativization of why the village is called Lasswade speaks to a different experience of the landscape and conjures up a sentimental image of Scotland's past, somewhat akin to the Kailyard literary movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. This is harmless enough from the publicans' and the tourists' perspectives, and if we ignored debates around the negative impacts of heritage tourism, I'm thinking of course about David McCrone's seminal book Scotland the Brand, published in 1995, and his discussions around how heritage differs fundamentally from history. More importantly from McCrone are the effects that the romanticisation of Scotland's past, referred to as Balmoralisation in the Highlands, has had on Scotland's people and national identity. Lasswade is perhaps an example, albeit somewhat innocuous and niche, of what he meant. As we will see shortly, particularly when Shamus resumes the stage, there's more at stake here than luring in tourists who, understandably it must be admitted, prefer the story of Sturdy Jenny over a now meaningless or at least irrelevant topographical description of a convenient place to cross a river. The key point is that there can be social, cultural and political issues associated with names and naming. The public approval of and attention to ethnic and linguistic minorities' own names for places in their own languages and folk idioms, for instance, goes hand in hand with democracy and equal rights. Please bear this important point in mind as we continue. To give an example of what I mean by this, we'll now move further north into Aberdeenshire and hear a folk onomastic from Stanley Robertson, who we met a few slides ago. Before we hear from Stanley, I'll give you some context around the town of Rosehearty that we can see on screen here. Rosehearty lies on the Moray Firth coast, 4 miles to the west of Fraserburgh in Aberdeenshire. Several onomastic sources agree that the rose in the name is the anglicised Gaelic Ross, which signifies a cape, headland, point or promontory. This corresponds with the physical appearance of Rosehearty, it being slightly elevated settlement where the land juts out into the Moray Firth. However, the same onomastic sources disagree about the significance of the hearty element. Some see a dwelling or shieling, a place to take shelter, sometimes used by people tending cattle on high or remote ground. Others see the hearty element as a sort of guiding or directing promontory that is useful when navigating a coastal landscape. As we witnessed with Lasswade, linguistic etymologies are useful in that they can provide topographical information that has the potential to reveal historical land use and or significance, whether it be as a shelter when tending cattle or as a navigational aid. Beyond historical land use, other onomastics align the hearty element and the corresponding suffix averty with the Irish personal name Avertach. Avertach is a figure associated with the Fenian cycle, a medieval Irish literary work that revolves around the legendary character Finn McCool and his warrior band. In the Fenian cycle, Avertach first appears as a character named the Hard Gilly, or the Difficult Servant. He often joins the Fenians during their exploits and can be quarrelsome, hence the epithet. And the Fenians set him various tasks, usually fetching a magic cup from the giants, running races, and the killing of a bull. His name is usually Caotoch. Alan Bruford assists us again when he informs us that the character's motive for joining the Fenians is seldom explained, and Alan therefore refers to Caotoch as an anomalous character. Not anomalous for our purposes, however. In the Fenian cycle, Caotoch is killed while serving the Fenians and is then resurrected. And this is the key point for us. The character is a revenant. He comes back from the dead. Outside of the Fenian cycle, Avertac also appears elsewhere in Irish folklore. One onomastician working in the 1930s, William Cook Mackenzie, has pointed out that Rosehearty in Scotland may represent a personal name that is derived from the Irish avak, meaning dwarf. It's speculated that the dwarf appellation might have a topographical significance, given the relatively small scale of Rosehearty that I mentioned earlier. From a folkloric perspective, however, we can take this further. Fieldwork undertaken in the second half of the 19th century in Londonderry by the onomastician Patrick Weston Joyce revealed that a certain Avertac existed in local folklore as a powerful dwarf magician who had terrorised the local community with great cruelties. Joyce alludes to a connection within the Fenian cycle in his folkloric account when he records that Avertac was at last vanquished and slain by a neighbouring chieftain, some say by Finn McCool himself. Beforehand, however, using his powers, Avertac resurrected himself on 2 occasions, inflicting further cruelties on the community, before being finally contained in his grave with the help of a druid. When Joyce's work, The Origin and History of Irish Names and Places, was published in 1869, he remarked that Avertac's sepulchre exists as a monument and that the legend is well known among the local population. The area in County Derry, Northern Ireland, where Joyce was conducting his fieldwork is named Slagdaverty and translates to Avertac's sepulchre on screen here. So the folk association with the Reverend Avertac is inscribed on the landscape in County Derry, both symbolically in the place name and tangibly through the cist grave that exists in the area to this day. Moving back to our Scottish examples, the place name suffix Averty, in the case of Dunaverty on the southern tip of Scotland's Kintyre Peninsula on screen here, can therefore be read as the personal name of the Reverend Avertac. This yields Avertac's Fort for Dunaverty and Avertac's Point for Rosehearty, where Averty and Hearty are simply variations of the same suffix or referent. And so, to an example, Scottish traveller Stanley Robertson, who we met a little bit earlier, tells us a story that presents an alternative yet related explanation as to how Rosehearty got its name, and we will listen to this now, hopefully.
This is a wee short tale I once heard from a man called Bob Strachan, who comes from Peterhead. And it's a story from Rosehearty and how it got its name. There was this young traveller man, and he was awful tired and he was seeking lodgings, and he was up Fraserburgh boy, because Fraserburgh and Adley was cried faithfully. And this traveller fellow was awful tired, so he gangs and seeks lodgings for a firm. And the farmer says, well, you could go into the barn. It was quite custom for to get a traveller and put him in the barn. The laddie went to the barn that night, and when he was lying in the barn, he says he was woke up, and standing beside him was a young man. And this young man says to him, could you help me? And the laddie says, me help you? What do you want me to help you for? He says, well, you see, many years ago, I was murdered here, and my body is buried under this barn, and I can't get no rest. Until my body's found and buried in a Christian grave, I get no rest. Oh, the laddie doesn't think nothing of it. So he gets back to sleep, and the next morning he thinks it's just a dream in his head. So he tells the farmer his dream. But the farmer was a religious kind of farmer. So only one of the farmer says, oh, never mind. So the same night he goes to bed, he was biding there 2 days. The same thing happened again. He was woke up again with the same young man who pleaded on him if he would bury him. Tell the farmer again. The farmer said, if you get it tomorrow, we'll go and we'll see the minister. The next day the same thing happened again. Came again, asked him to be buried. So they went in to see the minister. He says to the minister, look, this person keeps telling me every day that they were murdered and they weren't buried. So on a third day, they dug up underneath the barn and they found the bones of the laddie. So they took a grave and they buried his the laddie's grave. And that night when the laddie went to sleep, he says this person came back and just said, "Thank you, I can now get rest." And in the morning, it says a young man, Rose Harty. And that's how the name Rose Harty came. The village of Rose Harty, just a wee village about 2 miles from Fraserburgh. Just a wee interesting thing he said happen. Well, that man Bob Strachan tells me that story. He's not a traveller, but he was brought up with travellers, and he kens how the cant and kens how the travellers boys. It's just a wee interesting thing. It's all a wee snippet, but it's interesting to ken if there's any truth in the legend. You can, because I'm sure the school will easily find it if that's.
Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed that. Note the parallels with the legend of Avertak. Robertson's narrative also includes a revenant that requires 3 burials, and a religious figure is required to finally put them to rest. However, Robertson's narrative ultimately inverts the premise of the story. Instead of a cruel tyrant being removed from power, we find a young man murdered and hastily buried. In the place of a disturbing folktale giving Slag the Verti its name, we have an act of compassion and an emotional reward for the protagonist. And instead of a druid confining Avertak to his grave, Robertson's narrative employs a Christian minister to emancipate the murdered boy's soul. Moreover, because the traveller protagonist, Stanley uses the term traveller and therefore so will I, arises heartily, Robertson's narrative evokes a sense of exuberance that is absent from the naming of Slag Taverti. His story affirms the traveller's awareness of their heritage and the sense of belonging to the landscape, going so far as to ascribe the naming of places to the experience of a single traveller. Furthermore, as we heard, Robertson's meta-narrative extends its cultural awareness to the mainstream population. That man Bob Strachan that told me that story isn't a traveller, Robertson told us. But he was brought up with travellers. He kens all the travellers' ways. That's their habits and characteristics. In this way, Robertson invites understanding from the mainstream population at the same time as affirming the long and distinguished heritage of the travellers. The fact that his folk onomastic challenges received topographical etymologies represents the underlying ideological imperatives of these divergent positions. Topographical place names are often motivated by the desire to exert control over the landscape. They are often predicated on word meaning. That is underpinned by possession and stratification. Avertak's fort being a telling example, or the received onomastic for Rose Harty itself. You'll recall Rose Harty's word meaning being linked to navigation, for military purposes or otherwise. On the other hand, Robertson's onomastic transcends straightforward word meaning because it draws its meaning from the intangible cultural heritage of the travellers. When delivered as a story, Robertson's folk onomastic for Rose Harty embodies an ideology that is not based on power or control, but one that is based on compassion, understanding, and positive connections with the landscape. Or, as ethnomusicologist Sarah Reith puts it, concealed onomastics, such as the above for Rose Harty, mean that Stanley Robertson found an illustrative way to tell the story of his people's unique knowledge and cultural contribution. It would be wonderful if there was some deeper connection between these 3 place names on screen here, linked as they are through Avertak and the legend of the Revenant, and that the folk onomastic has travelled from hearth to hearth and ended up in northern Scotland, or vice versa. We can only speculate, but what this analysis does signal, at least, is a cultural connection between Scotland and Ireland, whether that be through an obscure corner of the Fenian cycle or through revenant legends passing from one cultural sphere to another and finding relevance in kindred oral traditions. Before we move on to hear from Shamus, I want to quickly share a few examples of place names that make more explicit references to Nackens, Scottish Gypsy Travellers, and Scottish Travellers. I'm going to go through these quite quickly because we're running out of time a little bit. A good example is Balquhidder, which sits a few miles south of Pitlochry in Perthshire. According to the excellently titled The Gaelic Topography of Scotland and What It Proves Explained, wish we could call books like to just be that blatant now. The Gaelic, and I'm going to get this wrong, help me out, Shamus.
Ballingyard.
Ballingyard. I can't do the gyard.
In the genitive plural, it reverts to the simple form because it's monosyllabic. Right?
Everyone knew that, right? Thanks.
So it takes a nominative singular. Okay?
Yeah, I'm learning.
As far as I was taught.
apparently. Yeah. So the author here, James Robertson, remarks that in the county of Perth there appears a hamlet called in English Balnagard, but the spelling in ancient writings is Balnacaird, which is nearly the pronunciation for the proper Gaelic for the name Ballynan Gyarst.
Yard. Yeah.
Or the Tinker Smithstown, which is on screen here.
Because the C follows the N, it's pronounced almost like a G.
We'll do this
like in
upstairs,
Gard. Yeah, okay.
In its anglicised form, Balnagard's etymology might signify a military site on account of the anglicisation. I'm going to skip this because we want to give time for Shamus, and I know that there's another performance later on this evening. Okay. My overarching point there was that the name over the sort of past 150 years or so, coming up 200 years, has changed. It's gone from an anglicised back to the authoritative the Tinker's Farm here. So this is Bord na Gaelic and the Scottish Placename Society and Historic Environment Scotland have reverted to the Tinker's Farm. So my point was that the name changes, the referent changes significantly. It's very important. And you will recall the village of Lasswade from earlier. Lasswade is a considerably more innocuous, innocuous example, but the principle is the same. At Lasswade, a local legend is exploited somewhat harmlessly enough to make a profit. At Rose Hearty, alternative onomastics gives us clues around the nature, transmission and function of certain cultural heritage. And at Ballynangard, the picture is more complex, with social, political and cultural issues at stake. Okay. There are other examples, and I'll do this really quickly, throughout the north of Scotland that we could examine this under these conditions as well. A few examples on screen. Okay, Shamus, earn your lure.
Oh, no, there. Crochtingard, or Crochtingard, Craigtingard, Ballynangard, Balquhidder.
Balquhidder.
Ball, like
Ball.
a ball. Balquhidder.
Okay, so finally to Balquhidder. So the same Gaelic place names partnership that were on screen a few seconds ago have this as the Hut of Hooder. Which apparently in the anglicised form is Butter as a personal name, a local family perhaps who are prominent in the locale. So Butter with an A. So Balquhidder, according to them, is Bothuder or Botpuder, and it's the Hut of the Butters. However, without further ado, let's have Shamus back on stage. The floor is yours, Shamus. Give us the actual reason that it's called Balquhidder.
Right, well, I'm just about to tell you.
Oh yeah, do this bit.
Now, here's an article that appeared in the Scotsman in 1933, and the reason it's been included is because the action unfolds in the curious incident at Balquhidder during the wars, and we can see at that time that although Nackens were still stravaiging around the countryside, you know, and performing the essential service for the farmers, the plans were afoot to create specially designated stopping places, and instrumental in this were members of the Home Mission Committee of the Church of Scotland who had previously visited the Surrey camps in 1932 and wanted to adapt the conditions to suit the Scottish Nackens and to sedentarise them and anchor the Tinker. Now, it goes on, there's another extract in the article, and it mentions the key family names in Perthshire. Among those names are Reeds, Stewarts, Whites and Johnstons, but it's come back to my ears that the veracity of the story about Balquhidder has been questioned in certain circles, and by the usual suspects, it has to be said. So we must guard against autodidacts and soi-disant ersatz ambassadors who masquerade as community members only to line their own pockets at the expense of, the Nackens. And so they can really be said to be merely acting the goat in some instances. And I just want to point that out. There's the proof of the pudding. My family, the Johnsons, recognised in 1933. So to any sceptics out there, I would say, get it right up you. Right? Now I want to proceed with the story, a curious incident at Balquhidder. And I was told to behave by Bob in advance of tonight, but, I'm not exactly PC at the best of times. And, I don't hold with rules and conventions and constraining norms. So I'm going to break with oral tradition at his behest and read the story to you. I think the challenge was to prove that I still retain a basic level of literacy. So we're about to find out. Anyway, as one who'd always sit in thrall of the storytellers and the listener, I must be the worst storyteller in the world ever. And I readily confess that. Nevertheless, I will attempt to relate as faithfully as I can what is, in essence, a simple story as first told to me by my naysmort, my mother, Agnes Johnson, some 50 years ago now. And it affords a glimpse of the cant, but I also want it to follow with a loose approximation in English. Now, I realise that's something which does not lend to the flow of natural storytelling, it has to be said. But hopefully we'll get there in the end. So the story starts, it was wheel past lousing time, the end of the working day, before the work clearing stones on a farm around Strathire was done, so the story goes. Now, I'm readily assured that Nacken manishes, women, were as used to carrying great clemmy stones as the gadgies, the men, although I couldn't swear blind that the practice still applies to this day. Now, the ow charts, old ones, were marred, mowed with gribbon to a guffy, some say gruffy, and a rompy cojones or a pluchy farmer with swalt jackers. Killed with work for a pig and a slave driver of a ploughman farmer with a round face, who'd stung them when it came to feaking their lure, paying the money due. Now, fair disgusted by this and having muttered odd profanity, down on their knees, cursing them upside down, they wanted to put distance between themselves and the scene of their labours, understandably so. And as such, they set off binging along the leg, taking the road before them, going high to the road and ho to the road, making their way back to Dunkeld and Pitlochry. But it wasn't long before the light grew evanescent, with nightfall encroaching. So someone, somewhere, took an executive decision to stop for the night. And lo and behold, up ahead, they chanced upon a shieling in the environs of Balquhidder. They deeked the glimmer of the yag through the water of the cane, so they saw the glow of the firelight through the window of the house. And a barry low it was too, a good blaze, suggestive of warmth and possible or potential hospitality. So one of the gadgies, seizing the initiative, took the scroof off his test, or his shero, took the hat off his head, stepped forward and chapped the bellament, knocked the door. And a now mort bunked the bellament. An old woman came at the door, dressed in what looked like late Victorian tuggery clothes. Her mouth was tight like a gastric band. Her apron looked like she'd been doubling up as Cinderella at the hearth, covered in ash and blackened cinders. But the Nacken gadgie proceeded and he said, he manged. Not wishing to impose, missus, but we're awfully cowled, weary and hungry, and wonder if you could provide shelter for the night. Could we maybe warm ourselves at your lovely fire? Indeed not, sighed the Mort, said the older woman. I make it a golden rule never to admit tinks into my good house. However, as one who embraces true Christian values, I suppose you could take shelter in the byre. I will send my son out with some tea and sandwiches. Now, being somewhat feral, like Minnie's a Nacken, he was sorely tempted to tell her where to stick her her nose, but soon came to recognise it was perhaps just as well, because he might have had to wipe his straws, his boots, on the way out otherwise. So clarty was the cane, so dirty was the house. There was ash and cinders all over the floor. So anyway, after he trudged to the byre then, sure enough, the Mort's son, a big Raj Gadji, big mad man, with the mental age of a cull geddy and a nain boy, a bit slow like myself, you know, bung out, came out with an ashet, a platter of bread, butter and cheese, nothing fancy, mind, just that and a pot of tea. But honest to goodness, the savour of the cow's jeer, the smell of the cow's shite was giving them the fukes, was turning their stomach. And it was all they could do to staunch the urge to retch, but they were weak as water. They'd had devil a hate all day, nothing to eat all day. So they rammed it down, divvied up and had the haben, ate the food between them, the perum, that's bread by the way, a lump of smout, butter, and a kibbick of kism, a block of cheese, dissected with a churie, a knife. And to wash it down, they supped the tea and slucht a wich and a peeve for a ruble produced for a goni, so took a wee snort of alcohol from a bottle out of a bag, as you do, Bob. And before streeching out among the strammel, the straw, and they eventually dovered awa, dozed off, and were slumming, sleeping, snoring and routing, farting like pigs in blankets. Right, but here, just ere the dawn, did there no come an almighty thunderplump, a heavy shower, and they were soon awakened by the deluge of Montyclear, or Panny, teeming in top of them like a cold shower. That's the water pouring in. Above their heads, the beams and the rafters were all charred. The roof had gone, and their surrounds were that of a ruin. Nettles and thistles up to their shoulders. So the Ros, disconcerted, the Manishes had taken a rickloff. They'd been badly spooked by this. Quickly rowed their chattery, bits and bobs, chatarra in Spanish, together and gnashed a vree, cut the gutter, made haste out of there, only to find that the house lay also in ruins. So they're back on the road now, and a bit bemused, seeking an explanation that might help them rationalise what had beset them during the night. They stumble upon a cottage and draw up at the gate. And Jens Mayer, once again, the same Gadji, possibly a Muchter or part Muchter, that's leader as well, chapped the bellman. And this time, an ow cowl answered, to which the Nacken recounted the curious turn of events. And upon hearing this, the ow chap raised his eyebrows and exclaimed that while he was surprised to hear the story, he wasn't wholly shocked because it had happened before. The inhabitants were maudit, perished, whammelt to a sinner, burnt to a sinner, some 30 years earlier. And he proceeded to tell how the sparks had also ignited the byre, so that went up. And it turns out that Ow Mort and the Cull Geddy were twa refsked, so there were two ghosts. Still, the Nackens had been ever so thankful for the wee cheese pieces. Wherever they'd come from, they'd been a godsend. So that, Morts and Gadgies, ladies and gentlemen, is how the word Balquhidder came to be passed down through the Johnson line as an intergenerational synonym of perum or bread. And next time you put a moulin or a sheaf of Balquhidder to your mun, put a morsel or a slice of bread to your mouth, I would exhort you to consider the seminal Gribbin, the work of Dr. Fell, in clearing Clemmies, stones from the field of onomastics. Whatever yous do, sleep well, don't have nightmares. Happy Halloween. Thank you. Right.
Thanks very much, Seamus.
Hope you enjoyed that.
Cheers. We're a bit short on time, I know. Is that clock accurate?
Perfect. We've got 5 minutes or so if you want.
Yeah? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Blame me, I overran, Bob.
No, but it doesn't matter how many times you time these. I had it down to 56 minutes. Apparently not. I think you've got some of my paper there.
I got
Seamus.
your papers, have I? Oh well. I'm not wanting that, so I better dispose of them. Here. There you go.
Thank you.
These
Should
must
be
yours.
16 now, that's the one.
Right.
Thanks.
Chored the lot, see that?
Chored, yep. Okay. Yeah, conscious. Is everybody all right to sit? I noticed there was a few folk had to leave, so I'm sorry about this. And yeah, we'll meet you upstairs afterwards, of course, for any questions. I had a fair bit to say about Shamus's folk onomastic for Balquhidder there, but I'm just going to skip on to that. Skip on to the final bits and bobs, just to give you an idea of the way that I perceive, with Shamus's help and the collaboration of other Nackens, this kind of folk idiom. So I'm just going to skip my analysis of Shamus's narrative, I'm afraid, but there are books available upstairs. Okay. So I mentioned at the top of the talk this evening, John Francis Campbell and the connection and/or the thread that runs from him through Alan Bruford and down to folk like myself and Shamus as well. So now, as early as the latter half of the 19th century, the concept that latent meanings exist within oral storytelling was recognised by John Francis Campbell while compiling his Popular Tales of the West Highlands, published in between 1860 and 1862. In his introduction, Campbell observes that he was aware of many tales whose defining characteristics are sagacity and hidden meaning. Campbell appreciated that not only do popular stories have specific meanings, but that the stories are conditioned by the socio-cultural context in which they exist and the language or dialect in which they exist and are transmitted. So describing one international tale he heard from a tinker, so that would be a Nacken in our modern parlance, Campbell remarks that it bore the stamp of the mind of the class and of the man who told it in his own peculiar dialect and who dressed the actors in his own ideas. Based on Campbell's commentary throughout Popular Tales of the West Highlands, his understanding of the material he and his colleagues collected in Scotland is lucid and groundbreaking. That the mind of the class and their own ideas and dialects, as we heard from Shamus this evening, are intrinsic to the stories they tell, is a penetrating insight into the nature of folklore. Campbell broke new ground by focusing attention on the tellers and the way that they manipulate their texts. So by the second half of the 19th century then, collectors of folklore in Scotland had realised that folklore can reflect real social concerns and anxieties and represent negotiations of the relationships that communities of storytellers have with other communities. In Volume 1 of Popular Tales, Campbell tells us of an encounter with a Nacken tradition bearer, for instance, and he describes how one story represented an incantation more vividly to me than anything I have ever read or heard, which is high praise from John Francis Campbell. I'm just going to skip on a wee bit as well, but Alan Bruford's contribution in that context as well is very much appreciated. We're all sort of dreaming the same dream. Some of you remember Professor John Niles' presentation of elements of his book, Web Spinner, about Duncan Williamson at the 2022 Alan Bruford Memorial Lecture. John's earlier work, Home in the Ranns, also on screen here, published in 1999, and his more recent work, Web Spinner, published in 2022, recognised that the Scottish Travellers and Nackens' living heritage communicates their values and beliefs in special and sensitive ways. A few years later, in 2002, Donald Braid's Scottish Traveller Tales demonstrated how Scottish travellers use stories as a way of responding to the social, political and historical issues that affect their lives. Mary McFadyen, another alumna of Celtic and Scottish Studies, who delivered the Alan Bruford Memorial Lecture in 2016, wrote an award-winning thesis in 2012 titled Presence in Imagined Worlds, Understanding the Mazy. Mary was lucky enough to work closely with Stanley Robertson, who we met earlier, and recognised a distinctive traveller aesthetic during her examinations of ballad traditions. I'm bemused as to why Mary hasn't published this, her thesis. It really is excellent. I'd like to conclude on a quote from Scottish traveller John Stewart, but I'm going to have to skip it. Can I go? Yeah, okay. I'd like to include a quote from traveller John Stewart for my audiences. This was recorded by the prolific field worker Dr. Sheila Douglas in 1978 in Pitlochry, where Shamus now lives. John is explaining to Sheila the difference between Scottish travellers and mainstream populations, and I quote from John, "We would look at a thing different from you altogether. Our way of thinking, our deep concern inside," says John, "our jealousies and our hatreds, our loves and our likes are far different from yours." Stewart's poignant evocation of deep concerns inside and ways of thinking encompasses the points that Shamus and I have tried to share with you this evening. However, it is not our intention to describe some unified field of Nacken or Scottish traveller identity, worldview or ideology whatsoever. Rather, the purpose was to show that by paying close attention to the narrative voices that come from the community, much safer conclusions can be drawn about the nature of the Nacken folkloric idiom. Shared understandings around history, folklore, place names, ancestry and local knowledge are the key identity markers within this living heritage. There is also a deep irony embedded within this idiom, where cultural differentiation and inclusion is negotiated beneath the surface. As Alan Bruford rightly observed at the top of this presentation, Nackens kept Scottish storytelling traditions alive, while they also invented a good many for themselves, and all this while suffering persistent and sometimes abhorrent persecution. With the help of tradition bearers like Shamus, my own work builds on these foundations. Campbell, McFadyen, Braid and Alan Bruford, of course. Showing how living heritage can be understood as a unique ecosystem in which Nacken tradition bearers interact with their history, making sense of the often challenging world around them, and affirming a granite sense of cultural identity and an abiding creativity. I wanted to call the book Nacken Storytelling that you can see on screen here, but the publishers weren't having it, so I do apologise for that. It's a little bit misleading. Copies are available upstairs, as I said. I'll finish on a quote from Shamus, who puts it better than I could. Nackens set great store in any art form. Musicians, craftspeople, artists, and by extension storytellers occupy an exalted status within our culture. It is an arts-driven culture. That is what matters most to us. I would venture that there is a vigorous sense of cultural continuity and self-determination, too. The attributes of the Nacken folk idiom, therefore, can also function as a challenge to group identities that are based on external naming conventions, and challenge misunderstandings that the community continues to face. Both personal and cultural autonomy are at the heart of the Nacken folkloric idiom then. Cultural identity, folklore and ideology are ultimately linked in their living heritage through the expression of the community's cultural memory, their cultural legitimacy and their astonishing resilience. From both Shamus and I, thank you for your kind attention.